Yeah, thank you very much, Margaret and Raphael. And also good morning, very warm welcome from me to our first panel on antitrust in cost of living crisis. What can competition policy do to help? In fact, the topic of this first session has a bit of a tradition at the CRA conference, and that is for a good reason, because fundamentally it is concerned with market power and high prices, ultimately what is one of the most important elements of competition enforcement, of course. And these are cross-cutting issues that, of course, affect enforcement priorities, intervention levels, as well as legislation such as merger guidelines, for example. But not only that. I mean, we, as Raphael mentioned, are going to talk about a lot of specific topics throughout the day. But these general trends in market power and prices, and especially also prices for essential goods like energy or food, are of course also very important for consumers' everyday experiences. So the attention that price hikes of essential goods on the one hand and rising concentration and markups on the other hand have received is hardly surprising, and it compels competition authorities to act, whether it be in terms of tougher enforcement or in terms of looking at price levels directly. Point in case, the CMA has just published last week its update of the review of the grocery sector, for example. So we will try to bring some clarity and structure to the discussion. I will have to disclose, though, that there are 5 other economists on the panel. My name is Lars Itos, by the way. I'm with CRA here in Brussels and Düsseldorf and the Munich office. So what we're going to do is we're first going to do a little bit of a recap of the latest insights from the research into the long-term trends of concentration and firms' markups. And I will ask Professors Jelena Larkin and Chris Conlon to kick off the discussion. Lena is an associate professor of finance and president of the NFA from Schulich School of Business in Toronto, and Chris Conlon is an associate professor at NYU Stern, New York. And then we'll also have a discussion of how much of these trends have contributed to the recent price trends in Europe, and in any event get the enforcer's perspective on whether and how to tackle price hikes if and when they arise. And in that regard, I'm very happy to have Ana Sofia Rodrigues, former chief economist and now commissioner of the Portuguese Competition Authority, and Damien Gérard, prosecutor general at the Belgium Competition Authority. So, Lena, if I could start with you to, as one of the early contributors to the research on increasing markups, to give us a first overview on the main findings and stylized effects, and then maybe you could come in, Chris, with your latest research. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lars. Well, over the past decade, can you hear me okay? There has been increased research interest that was trying to see whether trends in the product market environments have changed. And different researchers have looked at it from various angles. So, for example, my co-authors, Gustavo Grullon and Ronnie Michael and I, have stumbled upon a very interesting fact simply by working with a database of publicly traded firms. We saw, surprisingly, that over the past 20 years or so, the number of publicly traded firms in the US has dropped by 50%. And this phenomenon has been quite persistent. Now, when we look into that, we thought that maybe there is something wrong with financial markets. Being publicly traded is no longer available, and as a result, we see what we see. However, we soon discovered that this is not the case, and the overall size of the financial markets, as measured by the market cap, has been growing steadily in tandem with the growth within the GDP. Moreover, the sales by publicly traded firm has been representing a stable fraction of the overall sales by all corporations. Now, since this is not a financial phenomenon, we then started thinking as to what else could be behind it. And in fact, when you think about it, when market cap remains stable and in fact grows, whereas the number of participants drops, what essentially it means that the remaining ones grow in size. And that's exactly what we see. An average size of a publicly traded firm in US has tripled in real terms over the past 2 decades. So, since publicly traded firms have grown larger, we then try to see whether it also reflects product market dynamics, where large firms are also responsible for the larger share of sales. And this is exactly what we see. The standard measures of concentration, whether you look at HHI, share of top 4 firms, top 8 firms, whether you look at public firms, whether you incorporate public and private firms, all of those measures point consistently to an increase in concentration. And importantly, this is not just a high-tech phenomenon. The increase in concentration has been persistent across industries. In fact, 75% of the industries have experienced an increase in concentration. Now, after documenting this fact, we also try to see whether it goes hand in hand with some pattern when it comes to the profits. And to that end, we looked at the so-called accounting approach and simply looked at the operating profits of the firms. Obviously, that's not a perfect approach, but it's simple to implement, and given the nature of the data, it fits well the public firms. What we see is that increase in concentration was associated with the increase in profit level. Moreover, this increased profits have been transferred to shareholders in form of higher returns. As a result, shareholders in firms that operate in more concentrated industries have been persistently generated higher abnormal returns. As a result, taken together, this story is more consistent with the, say, market power explanation than with the explanation that accounting way of measuring profits may be missing something. Now, obviously, this is a very early work, and it is correlation-based, and we're using accounting-based methods, which has its flaws. But I think altogether, at the very least, it points to some interesting trends that are worth for the examination. And this is exactly what many follow-up studies have done. So the nature of the panel does not allow me to cover everything that has been done in the space over the past few years, but what I would like to mention is a nice paper that summarizes all those past endeavors using 10 simple facts. And this is a paper by Akchit and Aids, 10 Facts on Declining Business Dynamism. This paper mentions increase in concentration as fact number 1, and increase in markups in fact number 2. Now, quite a few studies have also tried to link the two from different perspectives. Again, there are quite a few studies on this topic. I would like to mention a couple of notable series of work. So one series of work has been done by Gutierrez and Philippon, who have also documented increase in markups as measured by using this accounting approach. However, they looked at it more from the standpoint of investment. Investment is another stylized fact that has been characterized in US markets, and actually European markets for that matter, for a couple of decades. Despite good growth opportunities, despite low interest rate, we have been observing that investment is lagging behind. And combined with high markups, one way to interpret it is essentially that companies are holding on expansion back. They don't want to grow as fast as they alternatively could, exactly for the reason that they want to maintain this market power over time. So that's one line of research. Another line of research conducted by DeLocker and his co-authors has tried to improve on this accounting-based approach by essentially, again, using this accounting-based approach as a starting point, but then trying to directly tease out the markets by looking at how sensitive the output is to the input quantity used. And using this approach, they also find that markups have increased in the US, and this increase is primarily concentrated in the upper tail of markups. So whoever was profitable has become even more profitable over time. Now, these two teams of authors have also expanded this, the analysis outside of the US markets and have looked at markets around the world and Europe in particular. And actually here the findings are somewhat different. Gutierrez and Philippon found that in contrast with US markets where markups have been increasing, actually markups in Europe have remained stable and low. And in fact, Thomas Philippon has used this distinction. He highlighted further in his book, The Great Reversal, How America Gave Up on Free Markets, where he essentially argues that this difference between Europe and US is essentially based on the legal environment. US is characterized by lax antitrust enforcement, coupled with high lobbying efforts, and that's what drives the differences between US and Europe. So that's one perspective. On the other side, DeLocker, using again the same production-based approach to tease out markups, has analyzed the vast majority of European countries, and he found that markups have actually increased in most of European countries, with the exception of Spain and Portugal. So he interprets these findings as, again, consistent with increase in market power. And it seems to me that this finding has been more prevalent when it comes to aggregating research that has been done on European markets in general. So a nice summary paper that summarizes efforts by European researchers to analyze markups in Europe has been done by Coltail, Lawrence, and Valetti, who highlight several studies who have looked at markups and who have looked at concentration and found increase in both. So this paper also analyzes what this increase in markups could potentially mean. And here they present two approaches. On the one side, there is this market power explanation, and to that end, they have a quite detailed discussion of the antitrust policy in the European Union, so that's one perspective. On the other side, it's still possible that the increase in markups that we see can be described, can be explained from the standpoint of change in the production. So the cost structure has been changing over time, and as a result, the markups that we see do not necessarily imply that firms are more profitable. So this is the overall debate, which in fact characterizes the current state of literature in the US as well.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a good point, maybe for you, Chris, to come in, because recent work of yours, I think, aims at sort of decomposing the causes or possible drivers, let's say, of increasing markups. So,
great.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, good. And I have slides here. Good. Can we put up the first one here? Good. So the first thing I'd like to do is just start exactly where Elena left off, which is to start with this sort of famous plot on markups. So this is DeLocker, Eckhout, and Unger's plot of markups in the US over time. And you can see they're increasing from about 1.25 in 1980 to about where their data ends, about 1.6 in 2018. And I've actually extended this through, I've replicated their thing, extended this through today. And so by, most recent data, it's sort of 1.65, maybe getting as close as 1.7, depending on the sample. So again, these are prices divided by what we think are kind of our best estimates of marginal costs. And what they're doing, right, is, as Yelena said, they're transforming revenue, total revenue divided by total cost of goods sold, and they're hitting it with this elasticity in the hopes that by hitting it with this elasticity, we're able to convert these average units to kind of marginal units, right? And there are some assumptions, and people have argued about whether or not they're getting it right. But I think, lots of people, I think, say, look, it looks like at least for sure, we can be clear that revenues are rising more quickly than cost of goods sold, right? And I think that's sort of the robust finding here. And there's lots of explanations people have given for this long-run trend. And, Elena covered some of them. Some of them are things like maybe this is driven entirely or predominantly by superstar firms. That is, Google has very, very high revenues, very low costs, at least in terms of cost of goods sold, right? They have some employees, but they have a ton of advertising revenue. They don't spend that much on servers and things like that. And kind of the related explanation that people have come up with is this idea of like intangible capital, which is sort of a clever way of economists saying they don't know. Right? That is, there's something about Coca-Cola where they take sugar and water and sell it for a lot of money and have for like 100 years. And it's sort of hard to explain exactly why. Some of that is investing in brands and things like that. Maybe these are algorithms for tech firms that make, search on one platform just much better than the other, but it basically means we can't explain it. But if we go to the next slide, with some exceptions, I think what we see is that we see the bigger puzzle, I think, to me, is that during this period where markups are growing really fast, right, and they're growing the fastest like in the mid to late 90s, according to DeLocher, Eckhout, and Unger, prices are actually not growing very quickly. And so we have this is just CPI in the US, for all the way back to the 80s. And, CPI is actually pretty stable up until the last few years, for the most part, or at least, if you cut out the early 80s. And so there's like this second puzzle, which is markups are rising everywhere except in the price index. And so then what's happening seems to suggest what we must be seeing are like large reductions in marginal costs that are somehow not being shared with consumers or not being passed through, right? And we have, I think, a pretty clear theory here, which is that firms with markups, firms with market power, are going to absorb some of these cost savings themselves, and they're not going to fully pass them through. That's sort of one story. And then the second story is that there could be just changes in the nature of production in the US. So some of this might be outsourcing. We're going to buy cheap inputs from abroad, right? But we're still going to sell them at similar prices, right? And this is like, you can make designer jeans in China for very low prices, but the real stuff is this intangible capital. It's the IP, it's the design of the jeans, it's something like that, right? And then the other story is that there's some other productive change, that firms are making these big investments in fixed costs and R&D and stuff like that in order to reduce their future marginal costs, right? But if we look at the next period here, in the next slide here, if we look at like recent changes, we see like it's a different set of industries and a different set of markets where we've seen sort of changes in the price index. That is, in the recent inflation episode, it's sort of mostly energy and food products, but also some durable goods and things like that. And usually we think about food and energy as associated with supply shocks. We usually think about durables like cars and appliances and things like that as mostly being driven by demand. And so now this idea where if firms aren't passing on cost savings, this becomes much harder here, because if firms aren't passing on cost savings because they have market power, we would also expect, or almost everybody would expect, firms with market power who are hit with cost shocks that are increasing their costs to absorb some of those and reduce inflationary pressures. So there's this idea that maybe like firms with market power are making inflation worse, but it's very hard to reconcile with that earlier, longer period if that's sort of the main driver. Now, if I go to my next picture, which is my own picture here, great. Okay, if we look at at the firm level, if we take the estimated markup changes from DeLocher, Eckhout, and Unger and look at the matched producer prices for the industries in which those firms operate, on the left is sort of the early period, 1980 to 2018, and on the right is 2019 to sort of Q3 2023. The correlation is basically zero, which is to say, you would think, or we thought when we tried to do this, that the firms where markups are rising are also where prices are going up. And that's just not in the data. And that's not in the data if you look even within manufacturing or within, you throw out services or you look only at services or something like that. And it's sort of, we can't get any sort of relationship here. And so that, I think, creates another kind of question, like what is going on? And so let me give you I don't have an answer, but let me give you another plot here, which is when, can I see the next slide? Which is, I think when people started saying like maybe, market power or profits of firms are driving inflation, are higher profits causing high inflation, I think what a lot of people did is they went back to accounting data and they looked at what happened between 2020 and 2021. What we saw over that period, and you have to kind of really start in 2020 for that to be true. In Q2 of 2020, most firms in the US were not paying their workers. The government was paying a lot of them, right, to stay home and not work during lockdowns. And if we look at 2021, when inflation kicks off, what we see is that prices move first, corporate profits kick off, and you saw this widely circulated. Every newspaper in the world said something like, corporate profits account for 54% of inflation or something, right? And this is coming from these national income product accounts, the things we use to construct GDP, right? And it's a heroic exercise where there's like one good for the whole economy. That good has a price, it has a labor input and it has some other inputs that go into it. And if we just do that same exercise, and there's a lot of problems with it, we do that same exercise through data for today, what we see is in the past year, it's all the labor share and then some, right? It's that over the last year, wages are rising faster than prices on average in the US, and so profits have to be going down sort of by construction, right? Just by counting. But even if we look back at the whole period over the last 3 years, the profit share is small. It's like 11%. It's like way below historic averages, right? And so this is much more consistent with a high demand, restricted supply story, where what happened was prices that firms were charging just moved first in 2021. And that labor and other input costs were just catching up, right? That those contracts just take longer to adjust and those prices adjust. And so that's, I think, where I'll leave it for now.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very interesting, and I think it's very topical as well. The Economist just this week has covered this, and those 128% that you see on the right chart is I think what was labeled as the blue collar bonanza, and maybe we'll have a chance to come back to that and then see whether that's very temporary and transitory phenomenon or is likely to be persistent. However, before we go into that, I wanted to come back to both of you because I was interested in yours and Lena's view on how this research and possibly also those latest findings are being perceived in the or on the other side of the Atlantic. What's the status of the sort of more practical discussion there, and possibly relatedly, to the extent that you want to comment, if we, stick with that hypothesis that the increasing markups are primarily driven potentially by decreasing marginal cost rather than increasing prices, what might be the implications of that? Is it, after all, industrial economists define market power as, some markup over price or over marginal cost? And is there anything like good or bad market power, if you like?
You want to go first?
Sure. No? Okay. I will learn it by the end of this panel. So I think in general, antitrust authorities, especially in the US, have been following this research quite closely. For example, the Council of Economic Advisors has been citing literature on increasing concentration going all the way back to maybe 2016, 2017. And actually the most recent reports now feature an entire section discussing in quite a lot of details the market concentration in the US and what it potentially means to consumers, to suppliers, to the labor market participants, and so on. And there have been a lot of actions taken on that front. In my mind, perhaps the most striking step that has been taken by the US administration was the order issued by President Biden in 2021 aimed to promote competition in the American economy, in which, so the order applied to essentially all, or the majority of federal agencies, and ask them to think of ways in which they can promote competition using the tools that are at their disposals. And there have been several follow-ups on this order since then, with the last one probably going back to last month. FTC has received much more power under Biden administration, and in fact, in June they have reviewed the merger guidelines and have issued some proposals. So altogether, it seems to me that over the past several years, at least the US antitrust authorities have been taking these issues quite seriously, and they've been looking at it from the perspective that what we observe is likely the sign of bad concentration rather than good concentration.
Yeah, I think there's two ways to think about this. One is, I think, what have enforcement agencies in the US, how have they responded to this? And I think, on one hand, I think part of the sort of the new crowd that came in with the Biden administration, in many ways wanted to at least rhetorically break with the past. And I think one thing that's a little bit challenging for them is that when they came in, a lot of what they said was that, look, we've been too focused in the past on low prices to consumers, we've been too focused on consumer welfare, and we need to focus on other things. And some of those things are just like concentration and firm size and the political power that goes with that sort of writ large. And the other has been, I would say maybe more controversially, I would say maybe like more harms to competitors, things that would sort of more typically fly in Europe and less in the US. We've got 2 Robinson-Patman Act cases now being investigated for the first time in probably like 30 or 40 years. And so that's cases where, the FTC was worried that retailers like Walmart or Total Wine & More or Trader Joe's were paying prices that were too low from the wholesalers. And so that would sort of push in the opposite direction of, we want low prices. And in some sense, like, we're going to be, the focus on low prices and sort of recent inflation, I think has actually made it a little harder for some of the newer things maybe the FTC maybe wanted to do. So that's sort of on one side. I think the other side is that if you look in the news media around like this profits inflation link, some of it was like, yes, we need more antitrust enforcement, and I'm all in favor of that. I think in many cases, like, it's a little bit like diet and exercise, which is I go to my doctor and he tells me you need to eat better and exercise more, and that's good for your long run health. But if, in 2021, we looked at like really high inflation and some other stuff, and this is like the patient is bleeding on the table, and it's like we need to stop the bleeding. And so diet and exercise is a good long-run solution that we should invest in, but there were maybe some more immediate concerns there. But I think that crowd, sort of this sort of heterodox crowd that's pushed this sort of inflation profits link, I think a lot of the reason they pushed this was that they were really worried that if the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, it would be bad for workers, particularly workers at the bottom of the income distribution, right? And I think you could look at 2021, and I think that was a legitimate concern. I think with the hindsight of like we did 11 rate hikes, and these people were opposed to all 11 rate hikes that the Federal Reserve did, after 11 rate hikes, we're at like, 3.9% unemployment and 3.2 inflation. So like standard textbook macro did way better than anyone thought standard textbook macro was ever going to do, right? We're going to see papers on how did this work so well? Why did this only take like a year? And so I think it would be very hard to look at the data from 2023 and say, oh, it was profits that caused inflation, but that isn't going to stop people taking a victory lap in New York Times interviews.
Great, thank you. So coming now to the enforcers and starting with you, Anna, how did you stop the bleeding? To stay with Chris' words, so just by way of background, the Portuguese Competition Authority is probably among those who have reacted most explicitly to recent price trends. You published 2 papers, Competition and Purchasing Power in Times of Inflation, and Defending Competition in Times of Inflation, Recommendations on the Value Chain of Consumer Goods. Could you give us an overview? What is the position set on the papers? What are your enforcement priorities? And also how does all of that align with your partners in the ECN? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lars, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm very glad to join this excellent panel. The part on the bleeding, it's a good way to put it, actually, right? So you have bleeding going on, and you have society in general saying, well, maybe competition authorities can come in and solve it, and those that are in the job think, okay, let's temper down expectations, and that's quite a lot what we did. And I think, as you said, Lars, we were one of the first agencies to react to the price increases, but also to decide of the expectations precisely. We published the issues paper with our position in terms of the interlinks between competition and inflation, and the role of competition policy inflation times in August 2022. So this was about 2 months after inflation peaked at the EU and the US. At the time, at the EU, the focus was more on energy prices. I don't think that was so much the case in the US. So allow me to give you a bit of context, or a bit of more context as to why we did that and what stance did we take. And that takes me back to the first time that we discussed this issue, which was 2 months actually prior to publishing the issues paper. It was a conference that was hosted by the Icelandic Competition Authority on the side of the ECN Chief Economist meeting. I was in a panel with Pierre Régibaud to discuss these topics, and at the time we were both expressing a surprise as to how was it possible that lack of competition was coming up as a possible candidate explanation for the inflationary crisis. And these voices were coming mostly from the US, but they were echoing at the EU as well. So that is probably one of the first reasons why we thought, okay, we need to take a clear stance on that, just to align expectations. And of course, and as Chris was saying, that made little sense, because you had a concentration, the empirical results to which both Lina and Chris referred to were showing increasing concentration over decades. And the inflationary trend was very recent, right? So it's very difficult to reconcile, and it makes little sense. Then there were other obvious explanations for the inflationary trend that were in the face of everybody, right? You had all the disruptions, the supply disruptions from the COVID pandemic. You had the stimulus measures with the reopening of the economy. You had the war in Ukraine that added up to all that. And then even theoretically, the first thing that comes to your mind when you think, okay, costs are going up, how will more concentrated markets react? Well, that takes you to the classic incomplete pass-through theorem, in which more concentrated industries have lower rates of cost pass-through, right? So that was our first reaction. Of course, there's another side of the coin, and we're not at the beginning of the inflationary trend anymore, right? So the incomplete pass-through theorem works the other way around when the cost drivers that set the inflationary trend in the first place start tempering down. So as energy prices go down, as the supply disruptions resolve, there I think, of course, concentration is even more of a concern, because if you have concentrated market structures, you are going to expect that there's some sluggish in the adjustment of prices to the reduction of the changes in costs. And we all know that this can be very worrisome, because you want an inflationary crisis to be as small as possible in time, in duration, because the adequate measures to deal with them, which is monetary policy, have obviously all the effects that we know in economic terms, and so you want to keep them running just for as much as necessary, no longer than that. Right, so in our issues paper, what we did was, as I said, try to temper down expectations regarding the role of competition policy. That is not to say, of course, that we were not saying that competition policy is not important in times of inflation. It is very important. We put the focus on purchasing power. One thing is an inflationary crisis. Another thing is a cost of living crisis. There are two very different things. So we highlighted all the ways that competition can help in trying to ensure that there's competitive discipline, consumers benefit from better prices. But we also highlighted that competition policy or competition law enforcement is not the primary tool to react to inflation, that is for monetary policy. And at the same time, we also warned firms that they should not take inflation as a cover for anti-competitive practices. So this was what we did in the first part of this inflation crisis, but things changed. By then, the focus, as I said, was more on energy prices. As time went by, the focus moved to food prices, right? So then there was a lot of debate about the increase in food prices and, again, calls for competition agencies around the world to look at it. Again, there were clear drivers for that, right? You had all the disruption in agricultural markets, in particular cereals and fertilizers with the war in Ukraine. You had still the lingering effects on energy prices. You have even weather conditions underlying that. But nonetheless, as I said, there was much discussion in Portugal about the price-setting behavior of firms along the food value chain, right? And by then, the Portuguese Competition Authority highlighted that we had a strong enforcement in this sector, in consumer goods in general, but in the food sector too. And let me stress there that over the past few years, we have about 10 to 11 infringement decisions for hub and spoke involving retailers and common suppliers. These are investigations that started in 2017. So there we thought that for the Portuguese Competition Authority, the main focus should be to keep enforcing competition law in that regard. But also we thought, okay, it's time to publish another report highlighting how important it is for all the agents along the value chain to behave competitively. We issued a number of recommendations building on all the experience that we had in these hub and spoke cases, with clear examples of do's and don'ts regarding behavior and price-setting behavior and interaction with competitors, mainly focused, of course, on hub and spoke and RPM. Okay, so this is what we did, and just to wrap up, because I think you were mentioning also our focus, our priorities. So we throughout this time, the whole time, we maintained our focus in strong enforcement. The other element of our focus, I must say, was in advocating for elimination of barriers to entry. Of course, it's a bit of a solution that it even takes more time than what Chris was saying, so it won't save a patient that is in an emergency room. However, we must learn from our experiences, and the lower the barriers to entry that emerge from regulation or strategic barriers to entry, the better the economy, and markets will react to unanticipated shocks and reduce the risk of reaching situations like the one we faced in June 2022. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And you have already touched upon one, I think, particularly heatedly debated topic, which was or is still increasing food prices, of course, because it obviously affects so many consumers. In Germany, for example, like we have had retailers rejecting price increases of producers with the consequence of temporary withdrawals of supplies. So like the tensions are really high. Damien, I was also seeking your view on that topic, and in particular, to what extent you looked into that specifically, and what the insights and consequences have been. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you to CRA for the invitation. Look, my off-the-cuff reaction on this tension is across the value chain in particular, is that they're very noisy, but they're generally healthy. That is, positive for consumers at least. But if you don't mind, I'd like to address your question as part of a more general discussion on how competition authorities in Europe have somehow approached inflation in the food value chain. And my basic starting point, I mean, I'm a lawyer after all, is that the current inflation wave is a shock. Okay, it's been an intense. Actually, I have a chart that shows that, in which I'm going to use to illustrate some of my comments. But anyway, so it's been an intense and very long-lasting shock that so all European economies have experienced for 2 years now. And as we all know, as Anna reminded us, so it's been a two-pronged shock, first affecting energy prices, more or less from the summer of 2021 with a peak in the fall of 2022, and then contaminating, here it is, a broad range of sectors, and in particular the food value chain. Now, if we use Belgium as an illustration, and some of you have live in Belgium and in Brussels. But so you can see from the chart that the blue line is raw material prices doubled between 2020 and their peak in May 2022. That involves cereal, dairy products, oils, etc. Retail food prices, the orange line, increased more sharply as from the summer of 2022, up to 17% on a yearly basis in March 2023, which was totally unprecedented. And in fact, throughout 2023, food products have been the largest contributors to inflation. And inflation in food products at consumption level is still today in Belgium around 8%, a bit more than that. And so, in fact, a shock of such a magnitude has put a magnifying glass on a range of market failure. And it's put certainly a magnifying glass on the existence and exercise of market power. Which is obviously our primary concern as competition authorities. And that is against the background of raising tensions, as you say, Lars, across value chains, notably in the food value chain between manufacturers and retailers, but also upstream, between farmers and processors. And these tensions have naturally been relayed at the political level, and competition authorities across Europe, notably at national level, have been called upon to take their share of responsibility. I think for good reasons, because obviously market power impedes price and other transmission mechanisms, but also with obvious limitations, as Anna underlined, because aside from the merger control area, competition rules prohibit particular conducts, and they take market structure largely as a given. So, more concretely, a very quick review of NCA's, that is National Competition Authorities involvement in fighting inflation, indicates that the focus has indeed been on the food value chain, and that actions have essentially taken 3 forms. First, it was a lot about compiling knowledge, right? So undertaking market studies on their own or with the support of other public authorities, with a view to essentially map market positions, monitoring price trends, and margin trends at different levels across value chains and across borders as well, to identify market failure and somehow objectivize or rationalize the observed tensions. And a range of such studies have been published this year in Spain, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, in Ireland, in Sweden, just to name a few. They're all public. And at Belgian level, we have 2 studies coming out in the coming days, one by the Belgian Competition Authority and the other one by the so-called Price Observatory, which is a division of the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And both have a focus on cross-border price differences for FMCG products. And what our study shows, in a nutshell, but that's just for illustration purposes, is that first, and that's not going to be a major surprise for all of you living in Belgium, average retail prices are, often higher in Belgium, than in neighboring countries, in particular for branded products, because if you zoom a bit deeper, in fact, for private label products, prices appear to be materially lower in Belgium compared to the Netherlands, compared to France, and even to Germany. And also what's interesting is that since 2016, prices have increased less in Belgium compared to the Netherlands, France, and Germany. Maybe the trend has reversed for some products in 2022, but that's still to be investigated. The third finding is that, we still have a drinking problem in Belgium. In the sense that, cross-border differences in manufacturers selling prices for alcoholic, but also soft drinks, is high. It's very high, and materially higher than differences, so cross-border differences in retailers selling prices. That gives me ideas. And then the fourth main finding is that competition at retail level has really intensified in recent years in Belgium, as reflected in reduced concentration ratio, but also lower reported profit margins. And what's interesting, and what our CET team, I see Chrétiens in the room, has shown and been able to identify, is that the reduced gross retail margins in Belgium seems to have contributed to a large extent to the reduction in cross-border price differences in recent years. Now, overall, and that's also apparent from the slide, what our data set also shows is that manufacturing price increases, which is the gray line, in the food sector have not been completely passed through, on average, into retail prices throughout the recent inflation wave. And paradoxically, and that's what Hannah alluded to, this has had the knock-on effect now of fueling tensions about the lack of pass-through of cost and price decreases. Right? Now, to come back to your question, Lance, like many other competition authorities, we have refrained from getting too much involved in policing tensions between, suppliers and retailers. We understand they can be pretty extreme and lead to, in exceptional circumstances, to refusal to supply or product withdrawals. But again, what you want is that there are tensions and that there is a form of balance between the different levels in the value chain, and obviously on the analytical framework, I think the 2023 horizontal cooperation guidelines offer very useful guidance there. Now, maybe highlighting a couple more issues. What's interesting is that issues with cross-border price differences seems to be a common and recurring concern among mid-sized EU member states, including Austria, Greece, Sweden, Hungary, in addition to Belgium. So, we seem to still see a significant price discrimination across borders. It seems to remain very prominent within the EU single market. And, I'm not taking sides here. But these conducts are naturally hard to capture and address because obviously this lack of arbitrage across border can be a function of multiple factors. Another interesting thing that we have observed recently is that inflation has revealed that there are other phenomena that seem to be common to mid-sized EU economies. For example, the correlation between the level of concentration in retail banking and the transmission of the increase in the ECB deposit rate onto a savings rate. This is an issue, in Austria, in Greece, in the Netherlands, in addition to Belgium, and that's something also we have identified in a recent report. And then just to conclude, so I mentioned, market studies and how NCAs in particular have invested in compiling and collecting knowledge. I mean, in parallel, NCAs have been involved in advising governments on a broad range of possible responses to inflation, and they have shared their experience within the ECN. I'll spare you the details, but the ECN has established a very interesting catalog of state measures which have been taken to, stop the bleeding and try to address, the inflation crisis. We can come back to that if you're interested. And thirdly, and obviously interestingly, echoing also what Anna said about hub and spoke cases, I mean, NCAs have leveraged the knowledge they've acquired in their monitoring work to really focus and prioritize enforcement action, and also refine their analysis individual cases, including merger cases. And so I think it's not really a surprise that you see a renewed interest for cases of, hub and spoke, price signaling, information exchange, and a continued interest in issues of collective buyer power, including buyer alliances, in the food value chain. I think on all these topics, we kind of fortunate also to have the new horizontal cooperation guidelines, which really offer a good basis for enforcers to have a consistent approach. And finally, in addition to sort of retesting the boundaries of established concepts, competition authorities have also been exploring the possibility of developing new tools, not strictly focused on particular conduct. You have all heard of the new competition tools. But also of rejuvenating possibly all the tools, and I'm happy to give examples if you're interested. But one of them is abuse of economic dependence, for example. So that's for my general overview at this point.
Thank you very much, Damien. I think that there's one thing I wanted to follow up on, and possibly with comments from everyone of the panel, because one of the possibly, most contentious issues was the fact that you have increasing prices that can be explained by increasing costs, and those increasing costs might be passed on to some extent, not to the full extent. But there has also been, especially in the food sector, a discussion about more than 100% pass on, if you like, leading to what is also referred to as profit push inflation. So you have increasing costs, but you also have increasing markups at the same time. And I was wondering whether, if you want to call it profit push inflation, that is something, you would consider or treat somewhat differently than, normal inflation. And whether you would target that specifically, or is something you look into specifically, as well as and possibly also to our academics, what's the possible explanation and causes of these kind of profit push inflations? Thank you. If you maybe with the causes would like to
there
start.
might be differences between the US and the EU on this point, by the way.
Yeah.
Well, would we take a stance on it or intervene on it? That depends on what is driving the result, right? I think, and Chris and Lena can elaborate much better on this than I can, but one can only speculate what type of factors may underlie that. They might be benevolent factors, and they might be more malevolent factors. You may have, for example, and I think all the research that is trying to find a link between concentration and inflation, of course, is limited in terms of the strategic interaction in between firms and what's put in the models. But maybe expectations regarding rivals' pricing strategies in face of inflation. You may have other benevolent explanations, as for example, consumer behavior might be different in terms of inflation, and that might change, of course, the pricing strategy of firms. If prices are changing too rapidly, maybe they expect consumers not to be so effective in optimizing their choices, or maybe they're more lenient towards when they arrive in the supermarket and they see a price increase because there's inflation around, so it's normal, right? So those are benevolent explanations. The other one, and I think Chris has referred to that already, is the fact that there's prices that take more time to adjust, and wages is one of those. So, you might have a mismatch there that explains the higher profits. Now, of course, not all is benevolence. You may have also collusion, right? You may have inflation might provide a focal point in which it might help firms to collude. We actually had in September this year an ESSO against a firm, a business association and a set of firms. It was in the sector of condominium management services. The practice at stake was fixing minimum prices for the sector. And there, it's an ESSO, so I cannot talk a lot about it, but there inflation played a role. And firms, the business association and firms took that as a stepping stone to reach the agreement, right? So this is, as I said, only an ESO. Now, another example, which we also highlighted in our issues paper, and which focus on labor markets, is that risk that in the face of inflation, firms might agree not to pass on inflation in the wages of their workers, right? And that is, of course, very harmful if you think of a cost of living crisis and an infringement to competition. So whenever there's an infringement to competition behind that result, of course, we would act.
I think one or two final remarks.
I mean, I just wanted to underline the fact that what's interesting in Europe is that you have seen the president of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, coming out, pretty clearly, warning competition authorities, look, guys, profits are actually making a significant contribution to inflation in Europe. And obviously, so, we, when Christine Lagarde speaks, we listen. And so we've sort of done our job also at Belgian level. I mean, first of all, the Belgian National Bank, very interestingly, has carried out a micro study at the level of more than 100,000, businesses, really looking at, cost and price levels, et cetera, and a sort of answer to the warning by the negative, saying, on average, at least, there is no widespread evidence of greedflation, in Belgium. But what's very interesting is that they came up with this chart, and there are quite a number of outliers there. And obviously, as a competition authority, that's exactly what you would be more interested in, is to look into the outliers. And that's something we certainly doing at the time, even though, I mean, there is a lot of work to do before turning such information into leads that, enable you to, find an infringement, but even open proceedings, right? Because, but that's certainly something that we look into, and these leads form part of a large body of information that has sort of become apparent through the magnifying glass of inflation, if you want.
Thank you very much. Lena, Chris, we are waiting for the Director General, but any final words, you're most welcome.
Sure, yeah. So I would say, we think about prices as being determined by some version of demand and some version of costs and some version of conduct. And so I think it's unlikely we saw wide economy-wide changes in conduct that somehow happened in 2021, right? But there are certainly certain industries have always been behaving badly, or look for any chance to start behaving badly again, and we should certainly go at them. But I think the profit push story, I think, is a little bit tricky, and it's a little bit circular, because you often end up with a story that's something like inflation causes inflation, right? It's like firms are using the fact that people are raising prices to raise prices. It sort of doesn't really tell us what the causes are. It's sort of more, at best, I would say it's a description of a really micro level timing of the phenomenon of inflation. And so we want to try to separate, economists try to separate the causes from just the description of how it happens.
I would like to offer more of a finance perspective on this topic. So Chris earlier had a joke that when economists don't know something, they say it's intangible. So when finance people don't know something, we say, we don't know, but the financial markets do. So to that end, and actually a nice thing about financial markets, at least when it comes to publicly traded firms, is that for every publicly traded firms, we have an additional indicator, stock price, which essentially tells me how much a company is bought today, given the aggregate perspective of all market participants who in fact put their money where the mouth is. So to that extent, if we see market cap of firms growing up, it doesn't really matter whether those high profits are generated through this mix of this decomposition of fixed versus marginal costs, or the exact pass-through rate. That becomes less important, because what markets price is the actual economic profits and how sustainable they are in the foreseeable future. And I think that's an important indicator that we shouldn't ignore. I don't have data about everyone, but just on the way here, I actually looked up a few publicly traded grocery stores in Canada, where I'm from. Over the past 3 years or so, market cap of the large grocery stores in Canada has grown between 60 to 100%. Just for comparison, S&P 500, which had an exceptionally good period over the same period too, went up over 30%. So these are just a few numbers that I want to throw out there and leave it to you to infer what they mean. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With these words, the Director General is waiting. I understand, so we have to leave the stage, but not without thanking all the panelists for this insightful and very engaging discussion. Thank you very much.